Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for inviting me. It's always a bit daunting to speak after Christopher because he actually prepares very well, and I kind of make slides and hoof it. But Christopher has destroyed my slides, so we're just going to have to hoof it. Now, as it actually turned out, when Tim asked me to speak at the conference, he said, "Sinclair, let's play some games." And I said, "Okay, yeah, I know Spin the Bottle and Strip Poker from my student days. I recall these games well." And he said, no, we want to teach people games about exchange. And I said, "Oh, yeah." I said, "Well, I don't normally do this sort of thing." He said, "No, don't worry. There's a package that you download off the internet. You download the package and we'll play the games in the venue." I said, "Okay, I'll do that." And I downloaded the package off the internet. And it came along, and I saw that you had to have these tokens. And the tokens had to be cut out and colored in. And I thought, okay, this is great fun, having to cut out and color in these tokens. And this reminded me when I was a student, I used to date a young lady who was studying pre-primary education. And I used to spend many evenings cutting out and coloring in for her... thanks, Will. Cutting out and coloring in for her student portfolios and what have you. And it just occurred to me that Tim just doesn't do it for me, thank you, in the same way that Leslie did, so we're not playing games. All right, so unfortunately there has been a bit of false advertising, so we won't be playing games. But certainly I'm going to pick up at the end of Chris's talk about the knowledge problem, because that certainly permeates all of economics. But before we even get to that, just the very basic question, what is economics about? Now, normally in Economics 101, we would start off with a definition of economics, and we would talk about Paul Samuelson and what is to be made and for whom and all this sort of nonsense. Or we would say economics is what economists do, or we'd say economics is about everyday life, and so on and so forth. Ultimately and fundamentally, economics is about exchange and trade. Not international trade, not fair trade, just any trade. It is about exchange. Economists should be talking about trading. Interacting with different people, that's what economics is about. If you start thinking that economics is about efficiency, you are going to get into a lot of trouble very quickly, and basically you're going to be a social engineer. Because we can all have ideas of what is efficient. Pareto, optimality, all that sort of stuff, these are value judgments. My idea of efficiency is you all give me your money. Okay, that would be a very, very efficient society. And I'm sure you would have your own visions of the efficient society. So I always try to steer people away from ideas of efficiency. Sometimes I do use words like optimal. I might say something like the optimal inflation rate is 0. The optimal tax rate is 0. Optimal levels of crime are not 0, for example. So things like that. But it's all about exchange and trade. And from there we build up a story. How do we facilitate trade? Why do we need to trade? And then you start talking about the division of labor. You then start talking about institutions, the norms that govern our trading and so on. So that is what economics is really about. For economics is really fun stuff. You know, why drug dealers live with their mothers, why sumo wrestlers cheat. It's all very good fun stuff, and if you're on a long flight, you should perhaps think about that sort of stuff. But it's not serious. When we interview academics at RMIT for positions, we always have one stock question. The one stock question is, tell us one article or book that has inspired you as an economist. And we once had some weirdo talking about the Samuelson-Stopler theorem. But normally people talk about something or the other. Those who say they've been inspired to become economists by reading Freakonomics don't ever get employed. It's just one of these strange things. It just doesn't sound quite right. So economics is about exchange and trade. Now, why should we care? Now, here I'm going to contradict myself very slightly. I've taken the freedom to trade data from the Index of Economic Freedom, and what they do is they say this is about international trade, not domestic trade. And I've said, of course, economics is about all trade. Somehow we seem to think that trading with a foreigner is somehow different from trading with a domestic person. That is just simply not true. Although there is much to dislike about foreigners. I've loathed foreigners since I became a citizen. But the benefits of trade are massive. So if you just have a look, those economies that have got more trade have higher per capita income. Now, you may say to me, GDP is a terrible number and doesn't measure all sorts of things, and yes, this is true. GDP tends to be very highly correlated with any other number that you really think is important. There is less hunger. Remember, in free market economies, you simply do not ever have mass starvation. And better environmental performance, if you think those things are important. Economies that trade have better indicators across the board, and that's all very good. Okay, so if economics is about trade, what are the problems we face in the economy? And it's not foreigners, it's not culture, it's not taxes. It is taxes, but that's another hat. I'll be talking about that perhaps tomorrow. But the biggest problem facing the economy is twofold: information costs and transaction costs. I went to a talk by Mike Munger a few months ago where he said it is all transactions costs. And yeah, I suppose to the extent that you think information costs are a subsection of transaction costs, but these are the problems. Information costs and transaction costs explain so much of the world that we don't understand necessarily, especially if you've come through economics in the neoclassical type framework. Once you start thinking about information costs and transaction costs, you understand a lot more. So our friends in Treasury in Canberra, some of them might be here. Sorry to slag you off. Not that sorry. But our friends in Canberra tend to think a lot about whenever there's something they don't quite understand, they think about monopoly. This is a monopoly. It must be stopped. So Jason and I were involved last year or the year before, I can't remember, on the interchange fees. And interchange fees were being sold by the government as a secret bank fee that you pay. And of course, everybody knows secret is bad and bank fee is bad too. So this was obviously a terrible thing, and they went in and just regulated it. And Jason and I actually explained that this was about information costs and transaction costs. It makes perfect sense once you actually understand the incentive structures that go into the interchange fees. And so these things actually explain a lot about the world that we might otherwise think is big business ripping us off. It also explains why we shouldn't trust government. In almost every course I ever teach, I include something called the socialist calculation debate, and I always have an assignment in every course that I teach on the socialist calculation debate. And in honor of, I brought my Hayek t-shirt. I did wear my Friedman t-shirt last year. The problem with Friedman, of course, is this is the man who invented withholding income tax. And he's clearly a communist and can never be forgiven. There are some things, of course, people can do wrong and apologize for, but with inventing the withholding income tax, of course, is totally wrong. Chris, in a very excellent op-ed in the Drum in 2011, I think it was, had this great line saying the big economics debate of the 20th century was not between Keynes and Hayek, and we can say that because Steve's gone home, was not between Keynes and Hayek, but in actual fact is between Hayek and Langer, and Mises as well. And in the assignments, I always try and change the meaning or change the word away from socialist calculation debate. I now prefer to call it the economic calculation debate, because a lot of students see the word socialist and then they run off on all sorts of tangents. But more or less, the idea that you can plan an economy at a macro level scale. This is an experiment that has been tried. This is an experiment that we have given our absolute damnedest to make work. Half the world, at least at some point, has tried this particular experiment. And of course, there's always excuses. It wasn't done properly. We didn't try this. They were peasants. They weren't sophisticated, what have you. But you can take a very simple experiment. You can take an economy divided into two bits. You can say, look, we will let the commies have the industrial part of the economy, and we will give the capitalists the farmland. Okay? And you fast forward this 50 years or so, and it's been done twice. East and West Germany, North and South Korea. and you observe what happens. The industrial space of the economy, which gets given to the socialists, ends up collapsing. The farmland, the capitalists, actually turn into valuable property. But in the economic calculation debate, there's two stories that are going on here. One, the first story is you can replicate what the market can do, and secondly, you can improve what the market does. And every single time this has been attempted, it has failed dismally, and the millions of dead people attest to this failure. Of course, the issue really isn't about socialism at a macro level. The issue is as follows. In the absence of market prices, resources must be allocated using a political process. And that political process is not going to satisfy consumers and users. Large segments of the Australian economy, oh well, never mind, we won't call Will back again. Large segments of the Australian economy are actually under political control at some level or another. The health system, the education system, the immigration system. We have a government that thinks that they can put quotas on importing goat herds. I mean, it's absolutely astonishing. We expect them to do badly in these things, and they do. So where you have resources allocated in a non-market process, you have problems. So those are the two biggest problems in the economy. What can go wrong? Well, two things can go wrong. There are lots of biases in our society. The first one is an anti-market bias. As Mike Munger was saying, you can't really just stand up and say, well, the market will solve that. We don't know what's going to happen, but we know it will happen. That's not particularly reassuring. There's an anti-foreign bias, as you discovered. We loathe foreigners. They've got different cultures. They speak with funny accents. They play rugby. All these things that we certainly shouldn't allow that type here. There's a make-work bias. You know, make-work is actually very popular. When you have the work for the dole scheme, why would you have bureaucrats sitting around thinking of things for people who are unemployed to do when they don't know what they do themselves? I would rather have the private sector making work for unemployed people. Pessimism bias. We're all going to go to hell. The property market is about to collapse. As it happens, my wife got bored recently and sold our house, so I'm short the housing market at the moment. So I'd be very happy if housing prices were to collapse, but I suspect not. Then there's utopia, the social engineers. The grass will be greener on the other side. If we only have this small little tax, it'll all work out well. People could be different. That somehow that if they just explain to us that we should care about global warming or rising sea levels or acidification or whatever it is, that we would say, I'm prepared to pay a higher tax and not have electricity. Or there's a free lunch. We can make the world we can make these changes without impacting anybody, anywhere or any time. So, it's all about trade. What can go wrong? What's important? Most important, the curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men and women how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. And that's it, and I think we're going to go to questions. So thank you very much.